There's no doubt we've seen the world change with the coming of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while countries across the world continue to battle the economic effects of the pandemic, some of the changes will likely be permanent. One of the biggest changes for the business world has been the rise of remote work. While remote work is not an entirely new concept, the restrictions on movement made it more commonplace than it ever had been. And since then, business owners have been more open to having employees work remotely. But that's not the only change we saw. The world also saw the pandemic reinforce gender inequalities in the workplace and also reinforce gender roles at home for many working women. While many women, particularly mothers, would like to continue working from home, men have largely opted to return to the office. And this may lead to women's isolation to the home, reproducing unfair domestic and emotional labor in the household. But is that something that should concern us and employers? The answer to that is yes. Women provide key contributions to the economy and labor market as they make up for 80% of Africa's agriculture, food, and petrol trade. Women form up to 50% of positions at entry level. However, this number decreases as they begin to have children and care for their families. Women are disproportionately disadvantaged by the unequal division of household labor, and this negatively impacts their career progression. This trend deprives the world of women's rightful contribution and also affects the earnings of their families. We've also seen what has been described as the Great Resignation. In the West, this refers to the elevated rate at which workers quit their jobs starting in the spring of 2021 amid strong labor demand and low unemployment as vaccinations ease the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there have been trickles of this on the continent as well. There's also the increased conversation around outsourcing as another consequence of the pandemic. 2 years on, we're all still trying to find our footing, but we can agree that the world will never be the same. Looking at workplace trends, is that for the better or for the worse? Today, our focus is the future of work after COVID. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. And joining me in the studio is Hilda Krager. She's the CEO of the African Talent Company and leads the job brands in 4 countries, including Jobberman, Nigeria. Hilda, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Tolu.
So let's start by looking at Africa's recruitment market. What are some of the trends we're seeing post-COVID in terms of roles and talent? And I'm really curious, are these trends a bit different than what we're seeing in the West? Or do we have some similarities in how the job market is really playing out?
One, there's a number of trends, right? One, overall, there's fewer jobs, naturally. Not everybody has recovered to pre-pandemic levels of employment. That's the first thing. Second, there's a difference in the nature of jobs. Where previously you had full-time jobs, full-time roles, there's now more around contracts, around gigs, around short-term temp work. Basically, nobody's trying to rack up full-time cost with uncertainty. We see similar things in the West. I think the difference in the structure of the labor markets overall, most Western countries have, and I come from, like, our company has a business in Eastern Europe as well. So we see there 2% unemployment, 1% unemployment. They're actually looking for candidates to get into roles because with things like the Great Resignation, as you mentioned earlier, people have left their roles and now empty, but there's no unemployment. So it's a job seekers market. Here it's the reverse. Unemployment is already high, really high. Now with these trends of the pandemic, it's getting harder to find a job. So that kind of changes the balance of things.
And you talked about nobody really wants to pay for full-time work in uncertainty. Is there still a feeling of uncertainty within the labor market, particularly for employers? We're getting vaccinated. Economies have opened. We're going back. People are moving around without masks anymore. So what uncertainty is there?
I think we're in a very interesting part of our lives, right? Right as the pandemic was receding, the war in Russia started, prices have skyrocketed. You look at the stock market, all tech companies in the red. I think there's been a lot of advisory around safe investments. So for a lot of people, it's like, okay, this is probably the first year in the last 2 years we won't have lockdowns. Probably by July or August. And I think the biggest teller for me is going to be how big are graduate recruitment programs this year. You know, we'll see that confidence begin to come back. But right now it's a cautious optimism. So where you could have a sales force of 50, maybe now you have 25 full-time and 25 on contract. If the sales do come through, you'll get 30 more and ramp up that way.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk a bit about remote work. It seems to be the biggest gainer in this whole conversation around job trends. And in many African countries, remote work has been a mixed bag. We want to stay home. We don't want to face the traffic. But when we stay home, we face electricity challenges, we face internet challenges, and just the general nature of how some of our countries are. And you would expect a city like Lagos to actually be leading the charge in remote work. But when it comes to the infrastructure gap for the continent, how successful and productive can we really be with remote work when these issues still exist?
Not very, to be honest. You're right around the infrastructure challenges, right? How even the cost of bridging that gap, unless there's a government or large institutions coming to bridge it, for the average SME, can you actually afford to give all your staff diesel and data? No. And even given that data, 100 GB, are you certain they'll use it just for work? Or are you subsidizing the entire Netflix lifestyle, right? You don't, you really don't know that.
For another job.
For another job, exactly. So you can't really tell that. And so what's happening is you find they would rather have people in the workplace, but even that has its challenges. Transport, rent, so it's almost like a balance of offsetting the cost. For larger companies, it's almost a no-brainer. Flexible work that was previously a reward, or you're a great employee, you can work home two times a week, or you've just come back from maternity leave, you can have one extra month at home. It's now the norm because they can afford it. They've got the infrastructure. For the average SME, they need the people in the places cheapest, which is together at once with one set of infrastructure costs and not 1,000 people or hundreds of people scattered across a city or so. But I think remote work is here to stay in one variation or the other.
Okay, so let's talk about a bit of that variation as it forms the informal sector. Because there's really no remote work in the informal sector.
That's
and
true.
The International Labour Organization says the informal sector accounts for about 85.8% of jobs on the continent. Aside from the 2020 lockdown, what really is sort of like the meeting place, is the junction where remote work and possibly the informal economy meet? Is there any bearing that the remote work economy now has on the informal economy?
For me, it's really, really small. If I'm to think about like a good use case, it would be where a tech-based aggregator that's working with maybe offline retailers, and there's a part of that organization that's remote, but the actual retailers are not because it can't be. Or think about logistics, the idea that a tech-based company that could be remote or distributed will still work with informal logistics workers, but still, it's a hybrid. I don't think we're at that point where you can be informal and be fully remote, no.
So let's look at the gig economy now. So there's so much terminology.
I know.
There is a lot of terminology when it comes to this. But this gig economy too is something we're seeing come up a lot. And you talked about it earlier in terms of contract work and basically part-time employees. So it's basically a market system in which temporary positions are common and organizations tend to hire independent workers for short-term commitments. In terms of the gig economy, is it really big on the continent? Is it something that's becoming bigger? Are we becoming more relevant in terms of it?
So here's the thing. The same way you speak about informal work, the gig work, the fundamental gig work has always been the largest employer across the continent. Farming, it's day labor. You show up today on time, you have a gig. You don't show up on time tomorrow, you don't have a gig. Factory workers, it's day labor. At best, it's weekly labor. Those are the gigs, right? A lot of the informal economy is a gig. That's just the truth. What has changed post-pandemic now is that the gigs, and even the creative sector has always been gigs. Photography today, none tomorrow. What's changed now is that we're seeing a lot more white-collar gigs. Be my HR associate for 3 months or for a month. Be my content creator for the next, 5 months. That's changing. That's becoming, we're seeing a lot more of that. And again, it's around that whole idea of you don't want to build up permanent costs. A permanent employee comes with pension, they come with healthcare, they come with industrial trainee fund contributions. So you find the total desk cost with a full employee is much more, up to 40% that of a gig worker. So you're seeing a lot more of that. But in terms of has the actual industry always existed, it's the bread and butter. It's now moving to the white collar space.
But it's interesting you say that because it seems everything you're saying in terms of how this is playing out is favoring the employers and not necessarily the employees, because one of the major criticisms of the gig economy is also a lack of job security and instability when it comes to consistent income. So is this just a period of time? Will we see this phase out, or we are stuck with this right now?
For now, I think it's here to stay. And the thing is, right now it favors employers, mostly because not every employee has learned to exploit it, not every gig worker. We're seeing a lot of success stories. There's many people who hold 2 jobs, 2 gigs. So as opposed to having 1 salary they had before, you now have 2. Some have 3, some have 4. There's lots of stories of young job seekers, 25 years, 30 years and below, who have quadrupled their income in the pandemic, simply because you're doing gigs, you're a software developer, you're a content creator, you're a blogger, and you have 4 employees and you manage your time somehow, you're 24 hours in a day, and you can quadruple your income. I think the more we focus on skills as opposed to jobs, and the more job seekers take that ownership to say, I want to be the best content creator possible. These are the skills I'm developing to gain it, and then I'll apply as much as possible. It'll begin to become an imbalance, and employers will get back to the place where they're saying, guys, I need a full-time person, please. You need to be full-time for me. What do I need to give you in order for you to be exclusive to me? That conversation will happen eventually.
All right, so we're going to pause our conversation now. The future of work is definitely an interesting one. And while Africa may not be experiencing the same trends as the West, we all have one area where we agree, and that's attention and action must be focused on women in the workplace and the economy. We'll pick up the thread of the conversation right after this. And still with me on Business Edge today is Hilda Krager. She's the CEO of the African Talent Company, which is home to Jobberman Nigeria, Jobberman Ghana, Brighter Day Uganda, and Brighter Day Kenya, and is looking to expand more into the African market. Now, Hilda, we've seen think pieces about how the pandemic affected Western women in the workplace in terms of work and, of course, the unpaid labor that the research shows us is there. But we haven't seen a lot of that attention really show us how African women in the workplace and the informal sector were also affected by the pandemic. So what do we know about the trends we're seeing with African women, particularly in the workplace post-pandemic?
I think one of the things we're seeing is, like women in the West, most African women were very happy to be home during the pandemic, up to a certain point. I think the difference in the West and Africa is that childcare is cheaper here. So you find that women who have help in the work in their homes, myself, for example, we were rushing to go back to work, similar to a man, because you've got your home sorted, and so you just want to go to the workplace with no distractions. You don't have toddlers in your back, etc. But the lower income women who actually do not have help in the home, they're very much happy to be at home. Of course, this comes with the burdens as well. You are doing 3 times the work, most likely, for the same amount of pay. There's lots of distractions. You work longer hours, and there's just a more blurry line between home life and work life. So I think that in that sense, it's similar.
So were African women disproportionately or around the same numbers affected by layoffs and things like that we saw across the continent?
I think so. My sense is, like in many instances, it could be higher, simply because certain decisions around, okay, you're going on maternity leave, should you come back? Both for the employer and for the employee, these conversations might have happened, but they were affected just as much.
So you talk, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. However, what we also saw is, because you can work from home, a lot of women who had left the workforce because they had had children came back in, because all of a sudden that huge barrier of leaving your children at home was taken away. So you can now do a remote work, you can work from home. You had already made the decision that I'm staying home, taking care of my kids, but now it's no longer a trade-off. You can do both. We see that as well.
Okay, you talked about the fact that women end up doing like 3 times more work at home than men, and the numbers bear that. Women spend about 1.1 trillion hours more than men on unpaid labor in the home, compared to 400 billion hours for men every single year. And this accounts for school work, school runs, medical appointments, feeding. It's basically admin, managing the home as it is. And then we've also heard that about 70% of employers in Lagos and Kano say domestic responsibility is a major barrier for women in the workplace. But more than 80% of women on the continent work in the informal sector. So when we look at that, what role do we expect women to play when it comes to the future of work, even particularly the informal sector where most African women are actually employed?
So here's the thing, that's not going to change for a while. Because the reason is women are choosing the informal sector, it's not always by choice, it's by necessity, right? You need to take care of your family, you need to take care of your children sometimes, because maybe you don't have a husband or something like that. At the same time, you have to earn a living. In the formal sector, it's not going to be possible. You need to be 8 hours in the workplace or else. I think that's going to continue. The work that needs to be done is to actually support these women. Make sure you can find, decentralized pension systems, for example, really broken down healthcare, the kind of interventions that would build resilience in this informal sector. Because the challenge here is, because it's also informal, if you don't have savings, you don't have pension, you don't have healthcare, the moment a lockdown happens, you're completely back to zero. And when you get back, you're rebuilding from zero. I don't think it's about to change. Just looking at agriculture, looking at day trade, and all these other issues, it will still be driven by women. We have to build resiliency in that sector.
And all the research, again, as I keep saying, the data always supports this. For the progress of Africa and the prosperity of the continent, women have to be involved. But we also have organizations like the African Development Bank telling us that for the continent to move past post-COVID recovery, women's empowerment is necessary. So what should we be looking at African governments to do when it comes to supporting women for equitable access to business opportunities, resources, even possibly legislation to be able to protect them and by extension help the economy?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is find women where they are. Fine, you and I, we're in formalized workplaces, we've got bank accounts, it's very easy. But across the continent, only about 34% of women have bank accounts. And a lot of them still have joint with my husband, joint with my brother, joint with my father. If you want to build resiliency, if you want all these business opportunities, loans, etc., go beyond the bank, you know. How are women saving? All these local savings groups where they're investing, where they actually do have credit, you know, they're just not well funded. Move beyond the formal economy and think about the informal structures within they operate. In a market, there's always a community of women working together. How do you fund those and build some sort of structure and resiliency around them? I think that's the difference that has to be made. If it's in the home about remote work, how do you provide tools? Is it a mobile phone for customer service? Is it a laptop for something a bit more sophisticated? We have to move beyond thinking of the informal woman, but creating solutions for the formal one.
That's an interesting point. I have to ask, do you think we've been paying lip service to the whole idea of women's empowerment, particularly the economic empowerment across the continent?
I don't think we've been paying lip service. I just think that there's so many historical challenges around women in the workplace, and every year we solve a little layer of it, a little layer of it. I mean, you know, 5 years ago, maybe not 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe I'll not be here because there'll be 2 weeks maternity leave instead of 3. So we have to admit that steps are being taken, but it's 1,000 steps on a huge mountain.
Okay.
Yeah.
So finally, let's look at India, which is a country relative to ours in size and population, Nigeria that is, and of course some of the economic issues they have. But India is the business process outsourcing capital of the world. I had to go and look up BPO for this. Exactly. And it runs 60% of the world's outsourcing economy.
Yeah.
What can countries like Nigeria learn from the BPO capital of the world? In terms of the lessons, do we even think that becoming an outsourcing destination is something that can really help Nigeria conquer its employment gap?
Of course, to an extent. Incidentally, the way India became this BPO giant, during Y2K, you know, all the computers have been structured to get to the year 2000. How do you get it beyond that? There was this huge panic, and they're like, we need a large force of English-speaking, affordable labor to help us convert this manually. What was the answer at the time? India, right? And that has remained the way for the last 20 years. In the pandemic, all of a sudden, India's in lockdown, Philippines in lockdown, and that conversion becomes, okay, we need, and also prices are getting higher, labor prices. We need a new source of English or French or whatever speaking communities in lower labor markets elsewhere as a backup or as an alternative. Where they're turning to now? Africa. It's in many ways a no-brainer. We speak the languages. In Nigeria, for example, you speak English, really high quality English. You've got a large educated force. And the BPO, what's outsourced, typically, it's not the most sophisticated roles. Yes. It's things that can easily be ramped up. It's customer service, it's digital marketing, it's some form of the back end of artificial intelligence. They're the things that we can learn. I think the time for Africa is now when it comes to BPO. We are the next frontier. We're the next place where an $1,000 salary is an amazing salary, you know? So I think we have to capture this opportunity. Nigeria already has, you know, people like Andela who are doing IT. It has Decagon. It has Hugo doing AI. There's many across the continent as well. In Kenya, if you go, you find Summersource, you find some of the largest companies in the world in BPO have started setting up foot on the ground here. For a job seeker, for a young person looking to get into this work, think through the skills that they typically hire for and upskill yourself. The opportunities are coming. And the opportunities are coming, and I hope Africa is prepared for the opportunities. This has been a conversation with Hilda Krager on the future of work post-COVID, particularly focusing on Africa and African women. Hilda, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you once again.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come up, or when we come back, that's me, that is, we'll be getting into NC4 to watch. Just stick around. All right, before we wrap things up, let's get you into a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. And we start in Northern Africa, where in the midst of a global trend of monetary tightening, Egypt raised interest rates for the second time since March, aiming to combat skyrocketing inflation and restore the appeal of its local debt to international investors. The Monetary Policy Committee said that the central bank boosted deposits and lending rates by 200 basis points each to 11.25% and 12.25%. Tanzania's annual inflation rate rose to 3.8% in April from 3.6% in March 2020. The total index increased from 103.95 in April 2021 to 107.88 in April 2022. The country's National Bureau of Statistics says that the inflation rate for food and non-alcoholic beverages grew to 6.6% in March 2022, up from 6.5% in March of last year. Aramco Trading Company sold its first shipment of West African crude, underscoring the Saudi Arabian oil giant's expansion ambitions for its trading arm. The company assigned a 1 million-barrel cargo of Equatorial Guinea's Zafiro crude for early June loading to ExxonMobil. The shipments will be processed by Exxon's own refining system in Europe. And finally, oil is heading for a modest weekly gain as optimism about the outlook for demand eclipsed concerns about tighter monetary policy and an economic slowdown that have combined to roll wider financial markets. WTI for June delivery eased to $110.85 a barrel on the New York Mercantile Exchange, as Brent for July settlements eased 0.9% to $111.06, or rather 6 cents a barrel on the ICE Futures Europe Exchange. And that wraps it up. It's been a week of amazing conversations on African business, finance, and of course, the economy. Don't forget that 11 a.m. West African time, Business Edge will be live right here on News Central. Follow us on social media, download our mobile app, and make sure, of course, that you watch us on the platforms we're available. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Have a fantastic weekend.